Chapter 10. The Strange Murder of Roy Micallef. One does not have to search the internet very long to find stories of spousal murder. The reasons for spousal murder are varied and diverse. Greed, jealousy, infidelity, and anger are some of the more common reasons, but sometimes the motive is not so clear and the circumstances are even murkier. On September 22, 1985, 50-year-old Roy Micallef was shot to death as he slept in his Houston home. When police arrived at the scene, it appeared to be a case of a burglary gone wrong, but soon after interviewing Roy's wife, 43-year-old Carolyn, investigators realized that they were about to embark on a very strange homicide case. A carjacking and a murder. Houston, Texas, is a large American city with typical American problems, crime being at the top of the list. The violent crime rate in Houston is fairly high, but as with most American cities, one can avoid most of the crime by staying out of certain areas. The Micallefs lived in a middle-income neighborhood where crime was relatively rare and violent home invasion murders were unheard of. Still, it was the big city and random crime can happen to anyone. But once homicide investigators took a statement from Carolyn, they began to see that this was no ordinary murder, and it was probably not random. The account that Carolyn Micallef gave to the police of her husband's murder was so strange that police initially thought that it was too bizarre to make up. According to Carolyn, she was carjacked and raped by a barefoot man with a knife 10 days before her husband was murdered, and then, somehow, the rapist learned her address and came back. On the night Roy was murdered, Carolyn claimed that the rapist came into her room where he tortured and raped her for some time before he found the pistol that she kept under her pillow. The rapist then went into Roy's room, who was heavily sedated from a recent back surgery and also convalescing from a heart attack, and shot him in the head at point-blank range in total darkness. The killer then ran for the door when he bumped into Carolyn and dropped the gun, which she then picked up and fired 2 shots at him, but missed. Obviously, the story had more holes in it than a slice of Swiss cheese, but the inconsistencies continued to pile up and cast even more suspicion in Carolyn's direction. The first question that police asked Carolyn was why she did not report the rape and carjacking that supposedly took place 10 days prior to her husband's murder. With a straight face and in a calm demeanor, Carolyn simply said that she did not want to upset her husband, who was recovering from recent health problems. The answer was suspicious, but suspicion alone is not enough for an arrest, so police began to investigate the carjacker story. Almost immediately, homicide detectives had a difficult time locating a suspect in the crime because Carolyn's description of the killer was not consistent. In fact, Carolyn said the killer rapist was white in her first statement, but then later said the assailant was black. When asked how she could get such an important and major detail wrong, she said that being in the South, she was embarrassed and did not want people to think she had an affair with her attacker. Other details of Carolyn's account of the murder simply did not add up. Carolyn, Roy, and the supposed killer were not the only people in the Micallef house that night. Carolyn's son from a previous marriage and his girlfriend were also present when the murder took place. Neither saw an intruder in the home, although both were awake at the time Carolyn claims he made his getaway. Then there was her behavior after the police arrived. Carolyn's account was described as rehearsed and for the most part terse. She then took a shower, even though she was explicitly told that doing so would damage any physical evidence from the rape. Although she did go to the hospital after her interview with police, she left before doctors could perform a thorough examination. Finally, she refused to take a polygraph examination. To most people in the Houston area, it appeared that Carolyn was her husband's killer, but despite the circumstantial evidence, Harris County prosecutors were unwilling to charge her without some tangible, physical evidence. It would be a long time before Ray McCaleb's killer was brought to justice. The years pass by. As the years after Ray McCaleb's murder turned into decades, the case slipped out of the minds of most Houstonians, but the Harris County prosecutors did not forget. Although there was a plethora of physical evidence in this case, they had the murder weapon and the body of the victim. The circumstances prohibited the prosecutors from charging Carolyn. Yes, her story sounded phony, but they had nothing to prove otherwise. But that did not stop the prosecutors from working on the case. A succession of prosecutors continued to quietly keep the case open. And they were not looking for the mysterious barefoot rapist. Carolyn was the authorities' only suspect from the beginning, and as they researched the woman's past, they were astonished with what they found. It turns out that Ray was Carolyn's 8th husband, and she was still legally married to her 7th when Ray was murdered. It turns out that when she left husband number 7 for Ray, she took the unlucky guy's $4,000 tax refund check for good measure. The information was enough to get Carolyn charged with bigamy, but was still a long way from homicide. Further investigation revealed that Ray and Carolyn were only married for a year and a half and that Carolyn was the sole beneficiary of his estate and insurance policy. Carolyn clearly had a motive to murder Ray. With the mountain of circumstantial evidence stacked against her, many began to wonder why the bigamist had not been charged with murder. Many people have been charged and convicted with less evidence. What made the woman who became known as Carolyn Kristen Wilson so special? It turns out that in the years after Ray's murder, Carolyn inserted herself nicely into the local law enforcement establishment. 2 of Carolyn's sons went on to become officers with the Houston Police Department, and somehow Carolyn was able to land job as a civilian employee with the same department. No doubt Carolyn's connections with the police department were a mark in her favor, but they ultimately did not stop Harris County prosecutors from charging her with murder in 2008. The charges were big news in the Houston area, and the ensuing court proceedings proved to only add to what was becoming a tabloid television-type atmosphere surrounding the case. Carolyn's attorneys argued that too much time had passed and there was no solid forensic evidence to tie their client to the crime, so the charges should be dropped. In a surprise move to many Houstonians, Judge Kevin Fine agreed and threw the case out of court, but Harris County prosecutors proved relentless and appealed the decision. A Texas appellate court reinstated the charges in 2012, and word of a plea bargain began to surface shortly thereafter. In 2013, Carolyn Kristen Wilson was a shell of her former self. Frail and suffering from Alzheimer's disease at the age of 71, prosecutors came to a deal with Kristen Wilson's attorneys. Kristen Wilson agreed to plead guilty to Roy's murder in return for a 6-month jail sentence and probation for 10 years. Many thought that Kristen Wilson should have spent the rest of her days in prison, but prosecutors were quick to point out that in the world we live in today that is obsessed with physical evidence, a hung jury or acquittal was a real possibility. Although some of Ray McCaleb's family did not share that sentiment, others were just glad to see Kristen Wilson finally admit her guilt. She is willingly admitting that she murdered him, and that's something we've known all these years, said Ray McCaleb's daughter Pam Nally. I think that means more to me than anything. Chapter 11.